It wasn't a scandal, at least, not at first. Just a discrepancy buried deep within palace accounts. A number that didn't align. A transfer that couldn't be explained. But when a senior royal aide flagged it for review, the silence that followed inside Buckingham Palace was louder than any alarm. Because this wasn't just an accounting error. It was something far more dangerous, and it had reached the king himself. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, it moved quietly, almost invisibly, through the corridors of royal administration. A routine audit, nothing unusual, nothing urgent, just another cycle in the machinery that keeps centuries of royal wealth and obligation in careful balance. The numbers were expected to match, the ledgers to reconcile, the system to function as it always had. But this time, something resisted alignment. A single transfer, flagged by a mid-level treasury officer who likely expected it to resolve itself with a second glance. Except it didn't. And when that same officer looked closer, the anomaly didn't shrink, it expanded. Reports suggest that what began as a solitary inconsistency quickly revealed a pattern. Not chaos, not randomness, but repetition. Transfers that moved without clear authorization. Amounts that appeared where they shouldn't and vanished without explanation. At first, the assumption was harmless, outdated entries, delayed documentation, perhaps even a clerical oversight buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. But the deeper they looked, the harder it became to explain away. Because the discrepancies weren't isolated, they were connected. Insiders whisper that concern spread cautiously at first, passed in hushed tones between staff who understood the weight of what they were seeing. This wasn't a corporate office where errors could be corrected with a memo. This was the financial backbone of the monarchy, a system intertwined with public trust, private estates, and the legacy of the crown itself. Escalation was inevitable, but it had to be handled with precision. No leaks, no panic, just quiet movement upward through the chain of command. And then, it reached the level where silence becomes strategy. Senior palace officials were alerted, and the tone shifted immediately. What had been a question became a concern. What had been a concern edged toward something far more unsettling. Because now, it wasn't just about numbers, it was about control. Who authorized these movements? Who benefited from them? And more importantly, how had they gone unnoticed for so long? When the matter was finally placed before King Charles III, those familiar with the briefing describe a moment that lingered. Not explosive, not outwardly dramatic, but heavy. Reports suggest he listened in silence, absorbing each detail as it unfolded, the implications settling in with quiet gravity. He had spent a lifetime navigating the delicate balance between tradition and accountability, but this was different. This was internal. And it carried a risk that extended beyond finance into the very perception of the monarchy's integrity. Early whispers began to circulate, not publicly, not yet, but within the palace ecosystem, where information travels without ever being spoken outright. This wasn't simple mismanagement. It couldn't be. The structure of the discrepancies suggested intention, design, perhaps even concealment. And as that realization took hold, so did something else, an understanding that whatever this was, it had roots. But what began as a quiet financial anomaly soon revealed a trail that led far beyond routine palace operations. As investigators dug deeper, the numbers began to tell a story, one that stretched across accounts, departments, and even private estates. What they uncovered wasn't chaos. It was structure, a system, and someone, somewhere within the palace walls, had designed it to remain invisible. What had first appeared as isolated discrepancies now began to align with unsettling precision. Transfers didn't just occur, they echoed. One account would shift funds quietly, only for a corresponding movement to appear elsewhere days later, almost as if guided by an unseen hand. Reports suggest that analysts tasked with reviewing the data found themselves tracing lines that looped back on themselves, forming a web that was far too deliberate to dismiss as coincidence. This was not error. This was orchestration. Insiders whisper that the deeper layers of palace finance, those rarely discussed outside a tightly controlled circle, started to come under scrutiny. Lesser-known trusts, long considered dormant or purely ceremonial, suddenly appeared active within the chain of transactions. Estate-linked funds, some tied to historic holdings and others to modern revenue streams, showed subtle but undeniable signs of movement. And with each discovery, the narrative shifted further away from simple irregularity and closer towards something far more calculated. There were mentions, cautiously raised, of duchy-related revenue streams traditionally governed with strict oversight and centuries of precedent. While no direct conclusions could be drawn, the mere suggestion that such funds might intersect with unexplained transfers was enough to unsettle even the most seasoned officials. Because within the monarchy, money is never just money. It is legacy, authority, and trust woven together in a system that depends on absolute control. And here, control seemed to be slipping. The pathways themselves became a focus of intense scrutiny. Transfers didn't move directly from point to point. Instead, they passed through intermediary entities' financial channels that obscured origin and destination, creating layers of separation that made tracking increasingly difficult. Those familiar with the structure describe it as a deliberate design, one that allowed movements to blend into the background of routine operations. A shadow network, operating not outside the system, but within it, hidden in plain sight. And with that realization came a deeper unease. Because systems like this don't build themselves. They require access, knowledge, and above all, authority. Someone had to understand the intricacies of royal finance well enough to manipulate it without triggering immediate alarms. Someone had to know where oversight was weakest, where attention rarely lingered, where small adjustments could go unnoticed until they became patterns too large to ignore. Questions began to surface not publicly, not yet, but within the guarded conversations of those now tasked with uncovering the truth. Where had the gaps in oversight emerged? Had they always existed, quietly tolerated as part of a complex system? Or had they been created, intentionally widened to allow this network to function undetected? The answers remained elusive, but the implications were impossible to ignore. Speculation, cautious but persistent, turned toward the issue of authorization, because movements of this scale, even when concealed, could not exist entirely without approval. Whether that approval was direct, indirect, or manipulated through layers of delegation remained unclear. But one fact became increasingly difficult to deny. Whoever was behind this understood not just the system but the limits of its scrutiny. And as the network came into focus, attention turned to one critical question: who had the authority to move money like this without detection? Inside palace corridors, conversations shifted. Voices lowered. Certain names once spoken freely were now avoided altogether. Because the deeper the audit went, the clearer it became. This wasn't an external breach. The source was internal, and it was dangerously close to the center of power. What had once been routine dialogue among aides and advisors began to fracture under the weight of suspicion. Reports suggest that senior figures within the royal household started holding private discussions, not in formal settings, but in carefully chosen moments where discretion could be controlled. The tone was no longer procedural, it was cautious, even uneasy. Because the question was no longer what had happened, but who might be responsible. And in an institution built on hierarchy and loyalty, that question carries consequences few are prepared to confront. Insiders whisper that an invisible line began to form within the palace structure. On one side, those who believed the matter should be contained quietly, handled with the same discretion that has shielded the monarchy for generations. On the other, those who saw something more dangerous unfolding, something that demanded accountability, no matter how close it reached to the crown. It wasn't a loud division. There were no open confrontations. But it was there, shaping conversations, influencing decisions, creating a tension that could be felt even in silence. As the audit progressed, fragments of information began to point inward, toward individuals operating within the royal ecosystem itself. Not outsiders, not opportunists at the gates, but those already inside, those with access, with knowledge, with proximity to the systems now under scrutiny. Various interpretations of the findings suggest that the patterns of movement aligned too closely with internal processes to be accidental. And that realization shifted everything. Because if the system had been used, it meant someone within it had chosen to use it. Speculation, as it often does, moved faster than certainty. Among palace staff, quiet theories began to circulate, passed carefully from one trusted voice to another. Media insiders, sensing the tension, began to pick up on subtle changes, unusual restraint from official channels, delayed responses, a noticeable tightening of communication. According to whispers echoed in outlets like The Times, something was building beneath the surface, something the palace was not yet ready to confront publicly. Efforts to contain the situation intensified. Access to financial records became more restricted. Internal communications were monitored with greater scrutiny. The goal was clear: prevent the story from escaping before the full picture was understood. But containment, by its nature, also signals risk, and the more tightly information was controlled, the more it suggested that what lay beneath was not just sensitive, but potentially damaging. At the center of it all stood King Charles III, increasingly drawn into the unfolding crisis. Reports suggest he demanded what was described as absolute clarity, a phrase that carried both urgency and weight, because clarity, in this context, meant more than understanding the numbers. It meant identifying responsibility. It meant confronting whatever or whoever was behind the network now taking shape. And for a monarch already navigating the pressures of leadership and legacy, the stakes could not have been higher. As suspicion narrowed, the atmosphere within the palace grew heavier. Every new detail seemed to point closer to the core, tightening the circle of possibility. And with each step forward, the risk of what might be uncovered grew more profound. Because in a system built on trust, the greatest threat is not external, it is internal, hidden where no one thought to look. But before any conclusions could be drawn, the king made a decision that would change everything. It came without warning. A direct order from King Charles III, swift, uncompromising, and impossible to ignore. An emergency audit, launched at the highest level, cutting through layers of royal bureaucracy. For the first time in years, the palace would turn its gaze inward, and nothing would be off limits. What followed was not gradual. It was immediate, deliberate, and unmistakably serious. Reports suggest that within hours of the directive, internal protocols shifted. Departments that once operated with quiet autonomy were suddenly placed under unified scrutiny. The message was clear. This was no longer a contained concern, it was a full-scale investigation, and the king himself had authorized it. That alone changed the stakes. Because when authority at that level moves, it does not move lightly. Insiders whisper that external auditors were brought in under strict confidentiality, their presence carefully managed to avoid public detection. These were not routine consultants. They were specialists in law, forensic accountants, individuals accustomed to tracing financial paths designed to remain hidden. Their role was not to confirm what was already known, but to uncover what had yet to surface. And as they began their work, the scope of the audit expanded almost immediately. What started as a response to irregular transfers quickly evolved into a comprehensive review of financial structures across multiple layers of royal operations. The ripple effect was impossible to ignore. Palace departments, some of which had functioned independently for decades, were instructed to cooperate fully, no delays, no exceptions. Access was granted where it had once been restricted. Records that had long remained untouched were suddenly reopened. And with each new layer examined, the sense of urgency deepened. Because the audit was no longer about isolated discrepancies. It was about understanding the system as a whole and whether that system had been quietly compromised. Security tightened in ways that did not go unnoticed by those inside the institution. Financial records were no longer just documents, they became controlled assets, monitored and protected with heightened vigilance. Access logs were reviewed. Permissions were reassessed. The movement of information itself became part of the investigation. Because in a situation like this, knowing who accessed what and when can be as revealing as the transactions themselves. The atmosphere within the palace, according to those familiar with the situation, shifted dramatically. Words like electric and unsettled began to surface in quiet descriptions of daily operations. Conversations became more guarded. Decisions, more deliberate. There was a growing awareness that something significant was unfolding, not just an audit, but a moment that could redefine internal trust. And with that awareness came pressure. Because in an institution built on continuity, disruption carries weight far beyond the immediate crisis. Comparisons, though rarely spoken openly, began to emerge in hushed tones. Past financial controversies, moments in royal history where scrutiny had forced change, were quietly referenced as points of reflection. Not because the situations were identical, but because they shared a common thread: the delicate balance between tradition and accountability. And now, that balance was being tested once again. As the audit intensified, the lines between routine governance and crisis response blurred. Every discovery led to new questions. Every question hinted at deeper layers yet to be uncovered. And with each passing moment, the realization grew stronger that whatever lay at the heart of this network was not just a matter of mismanagement, but something far more complex, far more consequential. But as the audit intensified, what it uncovered threatened not just reputations, but the very structure of royal trust itself. The first findings didn't leak, they detonated. Quietly at first, behind closed doors. Then louder, as the implications became impossible to contain. Careers hung in the balance. Alliances fractured. And within the palace, a sense of unease settled in a realization that this was no longer just an investigation. It was a reckoning. What had been whispered in fragments was now taking shape in undeniable form. Reports suggest that the preliminary audit findings revealed patterns too serious to dismiss, too consistent to ignore. Certain accounts, once considered routine, almost invisible in their predictability, were suddenly flagged for what insiders described as unusual activity. Not just one or two anomalies, but clusters. Movements that aligned too precisely, repeating across timelines in ways that suggested intent rather than error. And with each flagged account, the weight of the situation grew heavier. Insiders whisper that the reaction within palace leadership was immediate and deeply controlled. There were no public acknowledgements, no visible disruptions. But internally, the consequences began to unfold. Quiet removals, sudden absences. Individuals who had long operated within trusted roles were, according to various interpretations, either reassigned or placed under discreet review. No official statements confirmed these shifts, but the patterns were noticed. And in an institution where continuity is everything, even the smallest disruption speaks volumes. At the same time, the outside world began to sense the shift. Media insiders, long attuned to the subtle rhythms of palace communication, started picking up on inconsistencies, delayed responses, carefully worded statements that said just enough to deflect, but not enough to clarify. According to reports circulating in outlets like The Times and echoed by commentators such as Robert Hardman, there was growing speculation that something significant was unfolding behind the scenes, something tied to financial irregularities that could no longer be contained indefinitely. The palace communications team moved swiftly into what could only be described as crisis mode. Every word, every response, every public-facing detail was scrutinized with precision. The goal was clear: maintain stability, protect the institution, and prevent speculation from spiraling into certainty. But crisis management by its nature acknowledges risk, and the more carefully the narrative was controlled, the more it suggested that the situation itself was anything but controlled. At the center of this storm stood King Charles III, facing increasing pressure from all sides. Reports suggest that the weight of the findings, combined with the growing awareness of potential public exposure, placed him in an increasingly difficult position. Because this was no longer just about internal accountability. It was about public trust. The monarchy, long upheld as a symbol of continuity and integrity, now faced questions that extended beyond palace walls. And those questions carried consequences that could not be ignored. The emotional toll within the institution was palpable, even if rarely expressed openly. Long-standing alliances began to strain under the pressure of uncertainty. Loyalty, once unquestioned, was now being tested against the need for transparency. And beneath it all was a growing realization that whatever had been uncovered was not isolated, it was part of something larger, something that had developed over time, hidden within the very systems designed to protect the crown. As the fallout spread, the narrative continued to evolve, each revelation adding another layer of complexity. What had started as a financial review had become something far more profound: a confrontation with the limits of oversight, the vulnerabilities of tradition, and the consequences of silence. And yet, for all that had been uncovered, there remained a lingering uncertainty, a question that refused to settle. Yet even as the fallout spread, one question remained unanswered: how deep did this really go? For centuries, the monarchy has stood not just as a symbol of power, but of continuity, duty, and trust. But now, as the audit peeled back layers of secrecy, that legacy itself seemed to hang in the balance. Because this wasn't just about money. It was about what the crown represents and whether that trust had been quietly compromised. The deeper investigators pushed, the more the story began to echo beyond the present moment, reaching into the long, carefully constructed history of royal stewardship. Reports suggest that royal finances have never simply been about wealth, but about responsibility, a delicate balance between private inheritance and public obligation. The Crown's resources, from estates to revenues, have long been framed as a form of guardianship, held not for personal gain, but for national continuity. And it is precisely that principle, the idea of a sacred trust, that now seemed under quiet but undeniable strain. Insiders whisper that comparisons to past moments of royal financial tension began surfacing in private discussions. Not identical situations, but similar in consequence, times when scrutiny forced the monarchy to adapt, to respond, to redefine its relationship with accountability. Those familiar with royal history point to earlier controversies, moments when public perception shifted, and the institution was compelled to reaffirm its integrity. And now, once again, that same pressure was building, not from a single event, but from a pattern that suggested something deeper. Concerns about transparency, long debated in the modern era, began to take on renewed urgency. Various interpretations of the audit's implications suggest that the monarchy, while rooted in tradition, is no longer insulated from the expectations of a world that demands clarity. The idea that financial systems could operate beyond scrutiny, even within such an ancient institution, now felt increasingly difficult to justify. And as those concerns grew, so did the awareness that this moment could define how the crown would be viewed for years to come. Beyond the palace walls, pressure began to form in more structured ways. Government bodies, public institutions, and observers with an interest in constitutional integrity started paying closer attention. Not openly, not confrontationally, but with a quiet insistence that questions be answered. Because the monarchy, while symbolic, exists within a framework that depends on public confidence. And confidence, once shaken, is not easily restored. At the center of this unfolding tension remained King Charles III, navigating a moment that required both restraint and resolve. Reports suggest that internal conversations began to shift toward the possibility of reform, not as an admission of failure, but as a necessary evolution. Discussions of oversight mechanisms, of structural adjustments, of renewed safeguards, all began to circulate within the highest levels of royal administration. Because if the system had been tested, then the response would need to be equally deliberate. The emotional weight of the situation extended beyond policy and procedure. It touched something more profound, the identity of the monarchy itself. The crown has long been sustained not just by tradition, but by belief. Belief in its stability, its purpose, its role as a constant in a changing world. And now, that belief was being quietly examined, not by critics alone, but from within. As these reflections deepened, the narrative continued to evolve, shifting from immediate crisis to long-term consequence. Because whatever the outcome of the audit, its impact would not be confined to financial records. It would shape perception, influence reform, and redefine the boundaries of trust. And as history pressed against the present, the sense grew that this was more than a moment, it was a turning point. And as the weight of history loomed large, the final phase of the audit began to reveal its most unsettling truths. By the time the final reports were compiled, the picture was no longer fragmented. It was clear. Disturbingly so. What had once been dismissed as minor discrepancies had evolved into something far more serious, something that could not be quietly resolved or easily forgotten. The scattered threads that once seemed disconnected now converged into a single, unmistakable pattern. Reports suggest that the final audit findings did not introduce new chaos, they confirmed what had already been feared. Transfers once flagged as irregular were now understood as part of a broader sequence, movements that carried intent, direction, and consistency. The ambiguity that had protected the system in its early stages was gone. In its place stood something far more difficult to confront: clarity. Insiders whisper that the confirmation of unauthorized or unexplained transfers marked a turning point within the palace. No longer could the situation be framed as procedural error or delayed reporting. The evidence, as it had been interpreted, pointed toward actions that existed outside accepted channels, movements that bypassed oversight in ways that suggested knowledge of the system's vulnerabilities. And that realization carried a weight that extended beyond finance into trust itself. As the findings were reviewed at the highest levels, attention shifted toward the structure that had allowed such activity to persist. Various interpretations of the report highlight systemic weaknesses, gaps in oversight that, while perhaps once considered minor, had been quietly exploited. These were not dramatic failures, but subtle ones. Points where responsibility blurred, where checks relied too heavily on assumption, where authority could be exercised without immediate verification. And within those gaps, the network had taken shape. The question of responsibility, however, remained carefully handled. Reports suggest that while certain connections could be inferred, no direct attribution was made without qualification. This was not hesitation, it was caution. Because in an institution where hierarchy defines both power and protection, identifying responsibility is not just a procedural step, it is a decision with lasting consequences. Still, the narrowing of possibilities was impossible to ignore. The circle had tightened. The range of who could have been involved had grown smaller, more precise, more uncomfortable. Pressure, both internal and external, began to build with increasing intensity. Within the palace, discussions reportedly turned toward accountability, what it would mean, how it would be implemented, and who would ultimately bear its weight. Beyond those walls, observers, commentators, and institutions with vested interest in the monarchy's stability began to anticipate a response. Because silence, once a shield, was now becoming a liability. And the longer it persisted, the more it risked being interpreted as avoidance rather than control. At the center of it all remained King Charles III, now facing a moment that demanded more than internal resolution. Reports suggest that the expectation of an official statement began to take shape, not as a certainty, but as an inevitability. The findings had reached a level where acknowledgement, in some form, could no longer be delayed indefinitely. And with that expectation came a new layer of tension. Because what was said or left unsaid would define not just the outcome of the audit, but the perception of the monarchy itself. The atmosphere grew heavier with anticipation. Every development, every quiet confirmation, every carefully measured discussion seemed to lead toward a single moment, the point at which the institution would respond to what had been uncovered. And in that moment, the balance between preservation and transformation would be tested in ways few could have predicted. But the response that followed would determine whether this crisis would define the monarchy or transform it. In the end, the crown does not answer to whispers, it answers to history. And as the dust began to settle, one truth became unavoidable. Whatever had happened within those palace walls, it would leave a mark, not just on those involved, but on the institution itself. The momentum that had built through weeks of scrutiny, tension, and quiet revelation now pressed towards something inevitable. Response. Reports suggest that within the highest levels of the palace, preparations began not just for acknowledgement, but for recalibration. Because this was no longer a question of whether action would be taken, it was about how that action would reshape the monarchy's relationship with trust. Discussions turned toward reform, toward measures that could reinforce oversight and prevent the kind of vulnerabilities that had allowed the situation to unfold. And while no single decision could undo what had already been uncovered, there was a growing determination to ensure that it would not be repeated. At the center of this effort stood King Charles III, now framed not just as a figure navigating crisis, but as one tasked with restoring equilibrium. Reports suggest that his role began to shift in the narrative from a monarch reacting to events to one actively shaping the response. The emphasis, according to those familiar with the internal discussions, was clear. Transparency where possible, control where necessary, and above all, a reaffirmation of the principles that define the crown. Because in moments like this, perception is not separate from reality, it becomes part of it. The implications stretched far beyond the immediate findings. Royal financial oversight, long governed by tradition and internal protocol, now faced the possibility of structural change. Various interpretations suggest that new layers of review, stricter controls, and clearer lines of accountability were being considered not as a departure from tradition, but as an evolution of it. Because if the system had been tested, then its resilience would be measured not by resistance, but by its ability to adapt. Outside the palace, the reaction unfolded in parallel. Media narratives, shaped by fragments of information and cautious reporting, began to frame the situation as both a challenge and an opportunity. Some saw it as a moment of vulnerability, a rare glimpse into the inner workings of an institution often defined by its opacity. Others viewed it as a test of strength, a chance for the monarchy to demonstrate its capacity for self-correction. And within that spectrum of interpretation, public sentiment began to take shape, influenced not just by what had happened, but by how it was addressed. Internally, the signals of change, though subtle, became increasingly apparent. Reports hint at restructuring, at policy adjustments, at a quiet but deliberate tightening of systems that had once operated with greater flexibility. These were not dramatic overhauls, but measured responses designed to restore confidence without disrupting continuity. Because the monarchy, by its very nature, does not reinvent itself overnight. It evolves carefully, deliberately, ensuring that each step forward remains anchored in its past. And yet, beneath all the adjustments, all the discussions, all the carefully managed responses, there remained something more enduring, a recognition that this moment, however controlled, would become part of the monarchy's story. Not as a defining failure, but as a chapter. A test. A reminder that even the most established institutions are not immune to challenge, and that their strength lies not in avoiding scrutiny, but in enduring it. Because in the House of Windsor, power may shift and secrets may surface, but in the end, legacy is the only thing that endures. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.